The wind was the only thing that truly lived in this part of the Wyoming Territory. It was born somewhere in the high, stony peaks of the mountains and died 1,000 miles away on the plains. And in its passing, it scoured the land clean of everything but the hardiest grass and the most stubborn rock. It was a mournful sound, a ceaseless moaning that slipped through the cracks in a man's soul and reminded him of his own insignificance. The sky above was just as unforgiving. Sometimes it was a dome of pale, empty blue that seemed to stretch into eternity, so vast and bright it hurt the eyes to look at it. Other times, it was a low, bruised ceiling of gray cloud that hung heavy with the promise of snow and hardship, pressing down on the earth until you felt you could barely draw a full breath. In the center of this sprawling emptiness, Ilara Vance lived in a small log cabin built to withstand the wind's relentless assault. She was a woman in her late 20s, but the land and her grief had carved years onto her face, leaving behind a stark and brittle beauty. She was thin, whittled down to bone and sinew, her body a testament to scarcity and hard work. Her hands were a man's hands, calloused and cracked from chopping wood and tending snares, the nails broken and rimmed with dirt. She moved with an economy born of fatigue, each action measured and precise, with no gesture wasted on joy. Only her eyes, the color of a stormy sky, held any trace of the woman she had once been. They were deep pools of sorrow, but in their depths, a sharp, weary intelligence still flickered. Her days were a ritual of survival, a grim rhythm of chores that kept the crushing silence at bay. Before the sun was fully risen, she was outside, the cold air biting at her cheeks as she split logs for the hearth. The axe was heavy in her hands, its handle worn smooth by another's grip. She would swing it with a steady, mechanical rhythm, the thud of steel on wood the only punctuation in the morning's vast silence. Then she would check the line of snares she had set in the sparse woods behind the cabin, her steps light and practiced, her eyes scanning for the slightest sign of a rabbit or a grouse. In the afternoons, she mended. She sat by the small window, her needle flashing in the fading light as she patched Liam's old shirt for the third time, the worn fabric as thin as a memory against her fingers. Her isolation was as absolute as the horizon. The nearest homestead was a day's ride east, the settlement of Redemption 2 days south. She was an island in a sea of grass and wind. The past was never far. It lived in the cabin with her, a constant, unwelcome guest. It ambushed her in the quiet moments between chores. On the rough-hewn mantelpiece above the hearth sat a small wooden horse, its paint worn away by a child's hands. Sometimes, when the light hit it just so, she would see him, Thomas, her boy, 5 years old, with Liam's kind eyes and a laugh that could fill the whole cabin with sunlight. She would remember the weight of him in her arms, the feel of his small hand tucked into hers, the smell of wood smoke and sweet milk in his hair. The memory was so clear, so painfully real, that she would have to brace herself against the wall, her breath catching in her throat like a sob. When she sharpened the axe, she would remember Liam. He had made the handle himself from a piece of ash, sanding it down until it fit her hand as well as his own. He was a kind man, a strong man, his presence as solid and reassuring as the mountains to the west. He had believed in this land, in the life they were building with their own 2 hands. He had believed in goodness, in decency. The memories were not gentle whispers. They were shards of glass that twisted in her heart, reminding her of the warmth, the love, the simple, profound joy of the life that had been stolen from her. She never let herself remember the end, not all of it, but it was there, simmering beneath the surface of her days, a dark and bitter poison. At night, when she slid the heavy wooden bar across the door, her hand would sometimes tremble. She would stand in the darkness for a long time, her eyes scanning the empty horizon, a cold knot of fear and helpless, burning hatred tightening in her stomach. It had been 6 months since the raid, 6 months since lawless men, their faces cruel and anonymous in the firelight, had ridden down on their homestead and torn her world apart. She hadn't known their names then, only the sound of their laughter as they destroyed everything she loved. The blizzard came without warning. One moment, the sky was the usual oppressive gray. The next, the world dissolved into a churning torrent of white. The wind, always a constant companion, rose to a terrifying shriek, howling around the corners of the cabin like a hungry predator. The temperature plummeted, and the air grew so cold it felt sharp in her lungs. Snow fell not in flakes, but in a solid, blinding sheet, erasing the land, the sky, everything. It piled up in great sweeping drifts that buried the fence posts and rose halfway up the cabin walls, trapping her as surely as if she were in a coffin. This was no mere storm, it was the wilderness flexing its muscle, a display of its raw, indifferent power to crush and to kill. Inside, Elara hunkered down. She fed the fire sparingly, her small stack of wood now a precious resource. She rationed her food, a handful of dried beans, a strip of salted meat, making each meager meal last as long as she could. The storm amplified the silence inside the cabin until it was a physical presence, a weight on her chest. The only sounds were the shriek of the wind and the hiss and crackle of the fire, the loneliness, always a dull ache, sharpened into an agony. The grief she had held at bay with the endless repetition of her chores now washed over her in a suffocating tide. It was a coldness that the fire could not touch, a hollowness that no amount of food could fill. She started talking to them, her voice a low murmur in the roaring silence. "The wind is angry today. Liam," she would say to the empty chair by the fire, "you always said a storm like this has a story to tell." She would look at the little wooden horse on the mantel. "Thomas, my love, you would have been frightened. You never did like the thunder." Her conversations were a heartbreaking mix of the mundane and the profound, a litany of small details from their life together, punctuated by the raw, unanswerable question that haunted her waking and sleeping hours. "Why?" she would whisper into the shadows. "Why you? Why not me?" On the second day of the storm, a sound, faint and desperate, managed to pierce the blizzard's roar. It was a horse's whinny, thin and terrified, followed by a human shout that was snatched away by the wind almost before it was made. Elara froze, her heart lurching in her chest. Her first reaction was a surge of pure, primal fear. A stranger, out here, in this. Her hand went to the old rifle Liam had kept propped by the door. Her knuckles turned white as she gripped the cold steel. Her first instinct was to do nothing, to stay quiet, to protect the isolation that, for all its pain, had become her shield. She had nothing left for the world, and the world had nothing for her but more pain. She would let the storm take whatever, or whoever, was out there. The sound came again, closer this time, and weaker. A man's voice, calling out, stretched thin by the wind and desperation. A battle raged inside her. The part of her that had died 6 months ago screamed at her to bar the door, to put out the light, to disappear. But another voice, one she had not heard in a long time, answered. It was Liam's voice, calm and steady. "You never leave a man to the mercy of the elements. Elara, not ever. It ain't decent." The memory, sharp and clear as the day he'd said it, was a physical blow. Decency. It was a word from another life, a word that had no meaning in her world of grief and rage. And yet, it forced her to her feet. With a shaking hand, she lifted the heavy bar from the door. She pulled it open, and a wall of wind and snow blasted into the cabin, extinguishing the lantern and sending embers scattering from the hearth. A figure, more a sculpture of ice and snow than a man, stumbled through the opening and collapsed onto the floor in a heap. This was Silas. Elara slammed the door against the storm and dropped the bar back into place, her heart hammering against her ribs. She stared down at the man on her floor. He was in his early 30s, his face gaunt and gray with frostbite, his beard and hair matted with ice. His clothes were frozen stiff, and a fine dusting of snow covered him like a shroud. He was half dead. Her interactions with him were not gentle, not welcoming. They were efficient. She was not saving a man. She was performing a task. She grabbed him by the collar of his frozen coat and dragged him closer to the fire, his body leaving a trail of melting snow on the rough floorboards. She took Liam's hunting knife and cut away the stiff fabric of his coat and shirt, the material cracking like ice. She examined him for injury, her touch clinical and detached. There were no wounds she could see, only the deep, deadly cold that had seeped into his bones. She heated what was left of her rabbit broth and forced the lukewarm liquid between his chapped, blue lips, ignoring his weak moans of protest. She was acting not from a place of kindness, but from a rigid, ingrained sense of duty, a hollow echo of the woman she used to be. Silas drifted in and out of a frozen fog. In his rare moments of clarity, he opened his eyes. They were a startlingly clear blue, and in their depths, Ilara saw profound weariness, a soul-deep exhaustion that she recognized as if it were her own. He tried to speak, to thank her, but his voice was a raw, broken whisper. "My horse," he managed to rasp. "It's gone," she said, her voice flat. She had seen the poor beast when she opened the door, a dark shape already succumbing to a blanket of white just yards from the cabin. He closed his eyes again, a flicker of pain crossing his face before the cold stole his expression. He was a man of few words, but his gaze conveyed a lifetime of hardship. His body, lean and roped with muscle beneath the grime, was a map of old scars. His posture, even in collapse, was guarded, the posture of a man who had learned to expect trouble from every direction. The blizzard raged for 3 days. 3 days of being trapped in the small one-room cabin, their proximity a constant, uncomfortable reality. They barely spoke. The silence was thick with all the things they did not ask, all the sorrows they did not share. It was the silence of two people who had nothing left to say to the world. Ilara watched him from the corner of her eye as she worked. She noted the way he flinched at the sudden crack of a log in the fire, the haunted, far-off look that came into his eyes when he stared into the flames. He slept in fitful, shallow bursts, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. Sometimes he would murmur in his sleep, names she did not know, his brow furrowed in some unseen struggle. Silas, in turn, watched her. In his periods of quiet wakefulness, he observed the crushing grief in the slump of her shoulders, the raw, controlled anger in the set of her jaw. He saw the child's small, worn toy on the mantelpiece. When the wind shifted the snow just right, he could see a single, large grave marker on the small hill behind the cabin. He didn't need her to tell him her story. He understood loss. He recognized the bleak landscape of her sorrow because he had walked its desolate terrain himself for more years than he cared to remember. The tension in the cabin was a living thing. It was not the spark of interest between a man and a woman. It was the friction of two deeply wounded, intensely private souls forced into a shared cage. They were like two wolves caught in the same trap, wary and defensive, each circling the other's pain, careful not to get too close. On the third night, the storm finally began to break. The shriek of the wind lessened to a mournful sigh, and a strange, profound silence settled over the land. The fire had burned down to a bed of glowing embers, casting long, dancing shadows that made the small cabin feel vast and empty. They were sitting on opposite sides of the hearth, on the floor, the silence between them having stretched for hours, heavier and more suffocating than the snow outside. Ilara stared into the dying embers, watching the last of her firewood turn to ash. Finally, she spoke. Her voice was low and rough with disuse, the sound of a key turning in a rusty lock. She didn't look at him. She didn't ask his name, or where he was from, or where he was going. Such questions belonged to a world that no longer existed for either of them. "Sometimes the quiet is worse than the storm," she said. The simple, profound statement hung in the air between them. It was a truth so deep and so raw it felt like a confession. Silas slowly lifted his head and looked at her, truly looked at her, for the first time. The guard he held in his eyes, the hard shield of the lone wanderer, finally lowered. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. "The storm. You can fight," he replied, his voice a low rasp. "The quiet. It just eats you." That was it. That was all it took. The shared understanding. The first real human connection she had felt in 6 long, empty months, shattered the fragile dam she had built around her heart. A wave of overwhelming emotion crashed over her, so powerful it stole her breath. A single tear escaped and traced a clean path through the grime on her cheek. Then another. She didn't sob or cry out. She just wept, silent and broken, her thin shoulders shaking with the force of a grief too vast for sound. Silas did not move. He did not cross the space between them. He did not offer her empty words of comfort or useless platitudes. He simply sat there, a solid, unmoving presence in the flickering shadows, and bore witness to her pain. He was an anchor in her silent storm of sorrow. He understood. He understood that these tears were not just for a husband and a son, but for the crushing, unbearable weight of being the one left behind to survive. After a long time, the shaking subsided. She wiped her face with the back of her hand, feeling empty and raw. She looked at him, her eyes vulnerable in the soft firelight. The air in the cabin had changed. The wariness was gone, replaced by a raw, aching recognition of their shared brokenness. A powerful, primal need rose up between them, a need as old as humanity itself. It was the need for comfort, for the simple, defiant warmth of another human body to hold back the coldness of the world, the final, absolute chill of death. It was not love. It was not lust. It was a desperate, instinctual yearning to feel alive, to affirm their own existence in the face of so much loss. Slowly, Ilara pushed herself to her feet. She walked the few steps to the pallet of furs where he lay. She stood over him, looking down at his face, her expression a turbulent sea of desperation, sorrow, and a tiny, defiant flicker of rebellion against her cruel fate. The shadows thrown by the firelight played across their faces, highlighting the deep lines of grief and hardship that life had etched there. Her voice, when it came, was a near whisper, but it carried the weight of her entire world, of every loss, of every lonely night. "If you want me, take me fast." She reached down and pulled him by the hand, not into the darkness of her sleeping corner, but toward the faint, flickering light of the hearth. It was a desperate, symbolic act, a choice to embrace a single, fleeting moment of warmth and life over the cold, devouring emptiness that had consumed her for so long. It was a tragic and passionate attempt by 2 broken people to burn away the ghosts that haunted them, if only for one night. The world was born new in the cold, gray light of dawn. A deep and profound silence had fallen, the kind that follows the fury of a great storm. Outside, the landscape was unrecognizable, a pristine and rolling sea of white under a heavy, colorless sky. The snow was so bright it hurt the eyes, a clean slate on which no life had yet made a mark. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere was just as cold, but it was not clean. It was heavy with the awkwardness and uncertainty of the morning after. The fire had died down to a handful of sullen, gray embers, and a damp chill had seeped through the log walls, a cold that had nothing to do with the weather. It was the chill of regret, the coldness of 2 strangers who had shared a desperate, fleeting warmth and were now left with the ashes. Ilara and Silas did not look at each other. They moved about the small space in a stiff, deliberate silence, each careful not to brush against the other, as if proximity itself were an accusation. The raw, desperate connection that had pulled them together in the firelight had evaporated with the darkness, leaving behind a bitter residue of shame, vulnerability, and a deep, unspoken confusion. Ilara turned her back to him, her posture as rigid as a fence post, and focused on rekindling the fire. She scraped away the ash, laid kindling with precise, jerky movements, and coaxed a small flame to life. Every action was a shield, a wall she was building between herself and the man sitting on the pallet behind her. Silas sat hunched over, pulling on his stiff boots, the sound of the leather scraping against the floorboards unnaturally loud in the quiet room. He could feel her shame like a physical force, and it mingled with his own until the air was thick with it. For Ilara, the return of the light was a betrayal. It exposed the recklessness of the night, the moment of weakness she could not take back. A profound sense of self-loathing washed over her. It felt as if she had desecrated the memory of her husband, as if she had invited a stranger into the sacred space that belonged only to Liam. Her grief, which had been a constant, dull ache, returned with a vengeful, stabbing sharpness, now mingled with the poison of guilt. Last night, her actions had felt like a desperate grasp for life, a rebellion against the cold emptiness. This morning, they felt like a surrender, and yet, beneath the suffocating weight of her guilt, a confusing, undeniable flicker of something else remained. It was not just the memory of another's touch, but the faint, lingering warmth of the emotional release, of having shared the crushing weight of her sorrow with another living, breathing soul, even if only for a few hours. Silas was just as lost. He was a man who had made a life out of solitude, who had wrapped his own past in layers of silence and distance. The intimacy of the previous night had been an anomaly, a violent breach of the careful walls he had constructed around himself. He felt a strange and unfamiliar tenderness toward this haunted woman, a sense of responsibility that sat uncomfortably in his chest. But he also felt like an intruder, a complication in a life that was already shattered beyond repair. He feared he had taken advantage of her despair, even though he knew, deep down, that the need had been mutual, a desperate collision of two people drowning in the same storm. He was a drifter, a man who passed through lives leaving no trace. He had no right to be here, in her home, in her grief. The silence stretched until it was thin and brittle, ready to snap. It was Silas who broke it, his voice still raspy from the cold and disuse. "I can chop some more wood," he said, his eyes fixed on the floor, "to replace what I used." Ilara did not turn around. She stared into the growing flames. "The axe is by the door," she replied, her voice flat and emotionless. His curt dismissal was a relief. It set the terms. They would be practical. They would be strangers. He gave a short nod, though she could not see it, and went outside into the blinding white. This established the pattern for the next several days. They did not speak of the night they had shared. They did not speak of the past. They communicated through the language of shared work. The rhythm of physical labor became their conversation, a way to coexist in the small cabin without having to address the turmoil that churned between them. Together. They dug a path from the cabin door to the woodpile, their shovels scraping in a steady, shared rhythm. He climbed onto the roof, his weight sure and steady, and pushed off the heavy blanket of snow before it could threaten the timbers. She would have a pot of thin stew ready when he came back inside, and they would eat in their usual silence, seated on opposite sides of the hearth. In the course of these shared tasks, small pieces of their pasts began to surface, not in stories, but in unguarded moments. One afternoon, while they were resetting her snare line along the creek bed, Silas knelt and pointed to a faint disturbance in the snow. "A fox came through here last night," he said, his voice quiet. "See how the tracks are in a straight line? A dog wanders, but a fox has a purpose." He showed her how to place the snare just so, hidden behind a fallen branch, his knowledge of the land and its creatures seeming far deeper than that of a simple cowboy. When she remarked on it, he just shrugged, his expression closing off. "Picked things up," was all he said. Another time, as Ilara was salting a rabbit he had brought back, she began to hum a tune under her breath, a soft, simple lullaby. She did not even realize she was doing it until she caught him looking at her, his expression unreadable. She stopped abruptly, her hand flying to her mouth as if to hold back the sound. A fresh wave of pain washed over her face, so raw and exposed that Silas had to look away, feeling again like an intruder who had stumbled upon a private, sacred grief. A week after the storm, the wind scoured the snow from the small hill behind the cabin. That was when Silas saw it. He had seen the larger grave marker from the start, a rough cross made from 2 pieces of timber Liam had planed himself. But now, beside it, a second, much smaller cross was visible, made of two simple, unadorned sticks bound together with twine. The sight of it hit him like a physical blow. A husband and a child. The full, devastating scope of her loss settled in his gut, a cold, heavy weight. He finally understood the depths of the silence in her eyes, the reason for the grim, mechanical way she moved through her days. He said nothing to her. To speak of it would be a violation. But his quiet observation changed him. A deeper, more profound compassion replaced his guarded weariness. He began to perform small, unspoken acts of kindness, gestures so subtle they were almost invisible. He made sure the wood box next to the hearth was always full to the brim, saving her the trip out into the cold. He noticed one of the legs on her mending chair was wobbly and, while she was out checking her snares, he quietly fixed it, securing it with a small wooden peg. He began to take the more strenuous tasks without being asked, his lean strength a silent offering. Elara noticed, in the vast, desolate landscape of her life, these small gestures were monumental. They were tiny points of light in an overwhelming darkness. She began to see Silas not as the ghost of her moment of weakness, but as a man of quiet depth, of a kindness that asked for nothing in return. Her internal conflict did not vanish, but the sharp edges of her guilt began to soften, tempered by a grudging gratitude. A seed of curiosity about this silent, haunted man and the sorrows he carried began to take root in the barren soil of her heart. Their fragile, unspoken peace was shattered by the appearance of a lone rider, a dark speck moving slowly against the endless white of the plains. Elara saw him first, her body tensing with instinctual alarm. It was Jebediah Smith, a hard-bitten homesteader from a claim several miles to the south. He was a man steeped in a rigid, unforgiving morality, his face a permanent mask of suspicion. He rode over, he would claim, to check on the widow Vance after the blizzard. His real purpose was to pry. Jebediah's arrival felt like a violation, the outside world and its harsh judgments intruding upon their sanctuary. He dismounted, his eyes sweeping over the cabin, immediately fixing on Silas as he emerged from behind the woodpile. Jebediah's expression, already grim, hardened into a block of solid judgment. He noted the single small cabin, the presence of an unknown man, and the way the smoke curled from the chimney, and he drew his own ugly conclusions. "Mrs. Vance," he said, his voice a gravelly drawl. He barely glanced at her, his hostile gaze locked on Silas. "Made it through the storm, I see. Looks like you had company to keep you warm." The insinuation was as sharp and ugly as a shard of broken glass. Silas went still, his posture calm, but his eyes grew cold and watchful. He said nothing. "This is Mr. Silas," Elara said, her own voice quiet but laced with a steely dignity. "His horse gave out in the storm. I offered him shelter." Jebediah grunted, a sound of profound disbelief. "Shelter," he repeated, tasting the word as if it were poison. His questions to Elara were pointed and disrespectful, thinly veiled accusations. He spoke of propriety, of a woman's reputation, of what the good folks down in Redemption would think if they knew she was holed up with a drifter. He represented the harsh, unforgiving social code of the West, where a woman alone was a thing to be pitied, but a woman with a man she was not married to was a thing to be condemned. "I did what any decent person would do, Mr. Smith," Elara said, her chin held high. "I would not see a man freeze to death on my doorstep." "Decency can look a lot like foolishness from a distance," Jebediah countered, spitting a brown stream of tobacco juice near Silas's boots. He looked Silas up and down, taking in his worn clothes, his scarred hands, the guarded look in his eyes. "You best be on your way, mister. The widow's got enough trouble without the likes of you bringing more." Silas did not react, did not rise to the bait. His silence was its own form of power, a calm refusal to engage that seemed to unnerve Jebediah more than any threat would have. Jebediah lingered for a few more minutes, making it clear he was not satisfied. He finally mounted his horse, his face a thundercloud of righteous indignation. I'll be sure to let folks know you're not alone out here. Mrs. Vance, he said, the words a clear and ominous threat. So they don't worry themselves about you. He spurred his horse and rode away, leaving a tense, poisoned silence in his wake. The encounter with Jebediah forced their situation into the harsh light of day. That evening, the quiet in the cabin was different. It was no longer just awkward or sad. It was charged with the new reality of their shared predicament. They were pariahs now, allies whether they wanted to be or not, set against a suspicious and hostile world. The injustice of it all, the town's cruel hypocrisy, ignited a spark of anger in Alara that burned through the fog of her grief. It was that anger that finally made her look at Silas, truly look at him, and ask the question that had been hovering between them for days. "Why are you out here, Silas?" she asked, her voice low, alone, with winter setting in. Silas was staring into the fire, turning a small piece of wood over and over in his hands. He did not look at her when he answered, just moving on. "From what?" she pressed, the anger making her bold. He was silent for a long time, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and the low moan of the wind. When he finally spoke, his voice was a rough, quiet rasp, the sound of a man speaking of things he had long since buried. "I was a soldier," he began, "in the war." He did not speak of battles, of glory, of causes won or lost. He spoke of the aftermath, of the things he had seen, the things he had done, the things that had been done to him. He spoke of the way it hollows a man out, leaves him with nothing but ghosts for company. He paused, his gaze lost in the dancing flames. "After, I went back to Missouri, had a farm, a family." He said the word family as if it were foreign, something he had once known but could no longer claim. A wife, a little girl. He did not explain what had happened. He did not need to. The guilt and loss were so heavy in his voice that the tragedy was a palpable presence in the room. He tossed the piece of wood into the fire and watched it catch flame. "Some men are good at building things," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Good at keeping things safe. I was only ever good at breaking them, ended up breaking my own." His confession of being broken, of failing, resonated in the deepest parts of Alara's soul. In his quiet admission of failure, she heard a terrible echo of her own powerlessness, of her own failure to protect her family on that horrific night. A profound wave of empathy washed over her, so powerful it extinguished the last embers of her guilt and shame. She was not looking at a stranger, at an intruder, at a reminder of her weakness. She was looking at a fellow survivor, a man as haunted and broken as she was. His vulnerability was a key, unlocking the last, most heavily guarded door of her own grief. "Liam," she said, the name a painful, rusty sound on her tongue. "My husband's name was Liam. My son was Thomas." She spoke of them for the first time, not as ghosts, but as they were in life. She told Silas about Liam's skill with wood, how he could build anything, how he had built this very cabin with his own 2 hands. She described Thomas's obsession with horses, how he would run through the tall grass pretending to be a wild stallion, his laughter the sweetest sound on earth. She spoke of the simple joy they had found in this harsh, empty land. And then, her voice changed. It dropped to a whisper, thick and cold with a hatred that was as pure and absolute as the winter snow. "They were killed by a man named Caleb Granger," she said, the name leaving a foul taste in her mouth. "Him and his gang, they rode in just after sunset. They wanted money, whiskey. We had so little." She described the raid, the senseless cruelty, the way they had laughed as they set fire to their small barn. Her voice broke, but she forced herself to go on, to give voice to the horror she had kept locked away in the dark. Liam told me to take Thomas and hide, in the root cellar." She was shaking now, her arms wrapped around herself as if to hold her own breaking body together. "I did. I barred the door, and I listened. I just listened to everything." The act of speaking it aloud shattered what was left of her control. She broke down, not in the silent tears of the other night, but in great, wrenching, agonizing sobs that tore from her throat. It was the sound of a soul that had been ripped in two. This time, Silas did not remain a silent witness. He moved from his side of the hearth, his movements hesitant at first, as if he were approaching a wounded animal. Then, with a quiet certainty, he knelt before her and wrapped his arms around her shaking body. He held her, pulling her close, letting her weep against his chest. He offered no empty words of comfort, no false promises that things would be all right. He simply held her, his presence a solid, grounding anchor in the storm of her grief. This was the true beginning. It was not born of passion or desire or loneliness. It was born of a profound, shared understanding of loss. In comforting this broken woman, Silas found a sliver of redemption for the family he had failed to protect. In the solid, steady warmth of his arms, Ilara found the first moment of genuine solace, the first respite from her crushing sorrow. Since the murders, their shared tragedies, the dark, terrible secrets they carried, had become the bedrock of their connection, a dark but fertile ground from which a fragile, powerful love could finally begin to grow, a love defined by the mutual, desperate need to protect and heal one another in a world that had offered them nothing but pain. In the weeks that followed their confessions, a new season settled over the cabin, one that had nothing to do with the weather outside. The brittle, awkward silence thawed, and in its place grew a quiet, comfortable intimacy. They moved around the small one-room space with a familiar grace, no longer two wounded animals circling each other, but two people sharing a fragile sanctuary. The desperate act of that first night was no longer the defining moment of their acquaintance. It was merely the prologue to a story now being written in the shared language of loss and the slow, tentative growth of trust. Their days found a new rhythm, built around small, simple moments that, piece by piece, constructed the foundations of their love. Silas took Liam's old rifle down from its pegs on the wall. Its wood was dark and its barrel was cold, a relic of a life that was gone. He took Ilara out into the pale winter sunlight and taught her how to use it. "You need to know," was all he said, and she understood he was not just talking about hunting for food. He showed her how to stand, how to brace the stock against her shoulder to absorb the kick. His hands would gently correct her stance, his touch firm and impersonal, yet it sent a current of warmth through her that had nothing to do with the sun. He taught her how to line up the sights, how to hold her breath just before squeezing the trigger, how to clean the weapon with an almost reverent care. In these lessons, she saw the soldier he had been, a man of discipline and deadly purpose. In the evenings, by the light of the fire, Ilara would take out her sewing basket. She mended the tear in his worn coat, her stitches small and even. Silas would watch her, his face unreadable in the flickering light. He watched the way her brow furrowed in concentration, the deft, sure movements of her calloused fingers, and it reminded him of a life he thought was lost to him forever. It was a simple domestic act, the kind of quiet care he had once taken for granted, and seeing it now felt like a miracle, a drink of cool water in a desolate land. They began to talk more freely, the silence between them now a comfortable, companionable thing rather than a void. They shared memories, not of the trauma that bound them, but of the joys that had once defined them. Ilara spoke of Liam's hands, how he could take a rough piece of pine and turn it into a beautiful, sturdy chair, his skill a quiet magic. Silas, in a low, hesitant voice, told her about the daughter he had lost, Lily. He described the color of her hair, the exact shade of corn silk in the summer sun, and the sound of her laugh, which he said was like a string of little bells. These moments were bittersweet, each memory a ghost that brought both a smile and a fresh wave of sorrow. But they were also acts of profound trust, a mutual offering of their most precious, most painful possessions. They were allowing each other to see beyond the broken survivors, to the people they had been, the people who had once known how to love and how to be happy. Their physical relationship evolved as well, growing out of this new soil of trust and shared memory. It was no longer a frantic, desperate collision in the dark, but a source of genuine tenderness and affection. In the cold, lonely hours of the Wyoming night, they found a profound solace in each other's arms. Their coming together was a quiet, desperate affirmation of life, a defiant act of warmth against the ever-present chill of death that haunted the corners of the cabin. For Alara, it was the slow, painful reawakening of a part of herself she had believed was buried forever with Liam. For Silas, it was a way to feel a flicker of goodness, a sense of human connection that he was convinced he was no longer worthy of. They were two lonely flames, burning together to hold back the immense, crushing darkness. But the world outside their small sanctuary did not care for their fragile peace. As their supplies dwindled, a trip to the settlement of redemption became unavoidable. Jebediah had had weeks to spread his poison, and they felt its effects the moment they rode into the dusty, rutted Main Street. Alara had been to redemption a few times since Liam and Thomas had died. She had always been treated with a kind of pitying respect. The poor widow Vance, a tragic figure deserving of charity and soft-spoken condolences, that was gone. Now, as she walked beside Silas toward the general store, she was met with cold stares and hostile whispers. The women of the town, who had once offered her a sad smile, now turned their backs on her, gathering in tight, judgmental knots. The men looked at Silas with open suspicion and contempt. In their eyes, he was nothing more than a drifter, a vagrant, a man of violence who had preyed upon a vulnerable, grieving woman. The air was thick with their condemnation. The confrontation they had both been dreading happened at the general store. The storekeeper, a portly man named Henderson who had always been kind to her, now looked at her with narrowed, disapproving eyes. Jebediah was there, leaning against the counter, a smug look on his face. "Need some supplies, Mrs. Vance?" Henderson asked, his tone cold. "Yes, Mr. Henderson, flour, salt, and coffee, and cartridges for the rifle, if you have them." Henderson's eyes flickered to Silas, then back to Alara. "I am not sure I can extend you any more credit." "I have furs to trade," Silas said, his voice quiet. He dropped a bundle of prime rabbit and fox pelts on the counter. Henderson barely glanced at them. He looked at Alara, his expression a mask of sanctimonious pity. "Folks are worried about you, Alara, about your living arrangements. It is not proper." The raw injustice of it, the hypocrisy, sent a hot flash of anger through Alara. "My arrangements are my own business," she said, her voice shaking slightly, "and they have kept me alive through the winter." Jebediah snorted, "Alive and well entertained, from the looks of it." The lewd comment hung in the air, ugly and vile. Before Alara could react, Silas stepped forward, moving between her and the counter. He did not raise his voice. He did not reach for the pistol at his hip. He simply looked at Henderson, his gaze quiet, intense, and as cold as a grave. It was the look of a man who had seen the worst of what men could do to each other, a man who had participated in it. It was a look that promised a capacity for violence that was far more terrifying than any loud threat. Under that silent, unnerving gaze, Henderson's smug certainty seemed to wither. The other men in the store shuffled their feet and fell silent. Silas placed a few coins on the counter, enough to cover their supplies. "We will take the flour, salt, coffee, and the cartridges," he said, his voice still quiet, but with an edge of steel that cut through the tension. Henderson, his face now pale, quickly gathered their things. They left the store, the hostile silence of the townspeople following them like a shadow. The long ride back to the cabin was tense. Alara was shaken, her anger at the town's cruelty warring with a deep sense of shame and isolation. Silas was grim, his jaw set in a hard line. He understood now. The settlement would offer them no help, no community, only judgment. They were utterly and completely on their own. The shared experience of being ostracized, of being cast out together, did not break them. It solidified their bond, forging them into something new. They were no longer just two individuals sheltering together. They were a unit, a family of two, set against the world. Far to the north, in a filthy, wind-swept encampment in the foothills, the world they were set against was stirring. Caleb Granger spat a stream of tobacco juice into his campfire and wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. He and his men were brutal, desperate animals, products of a harsh land that rewarded violence and punished weakness. Granger, however, was more than just a brute. He was cunning, a wolf who knew how to lead the pack. He survived because he was smarter and more ruthless than the men around him. A trapper, passing through their camp to trade whiskey for pelts, had brought a piece of news. The gossip had trickled down from the settlement of Redemption, a story about the Vance widow who had taken in a drifter. Granger remembered the Vance homestead. It had been a poor raid, yielding little more than a few dollars and a half-empty sack of grain. But the news that there was a man there now piqued his interest. A man meant there might be more of value, a good rifle, a decent horse, maybe even a hidden stash of money. More than that, it was a personal affront. It felt like someone had moved in on his territory, a claim he had marked with blood and fire. He decided it was time to pay the homestead another visit. This time, he would be more thorough. He and his men were wolves who had scented an opportunity, and they were hungry. Back at the cabin, Ilara and Silas were blissfully unaware of the danger gathering on the horizon. Their life had settled into a rhythm of survival and a quiet, comforting domesticity. They worked to fortify the cabin for the deep winter that was still to come, chinking the logs with fresh mud and moss, reinforcing the door. Their shared life was a small island of warmth and hope in a vast, indifferent sea of hostility. They even found moments of simple, unlooked-for joy. A shared laugh when a rabbit stew boiled over onto the hearth. The quiet awe of watching a sunset paint the snow-covered plains in fiery strokes of orange and purple. These moments were precious and precarious, small, flickering flames of happiness that highlighted exactly how much they now had to lose. The attack came at dusk. The sky was a bruised purple, and the world was sinking into that gray, uncertain light between day and night. The Granger gang, 5 men strong, descended on the cabin like wraiths, their horses' hooves muffled by the lingering snow. They were not expecting a fight. They were expecting a lone woman and her lover, soft and unsuspecting. A sharp, unnatural crack of a twig breaking under a heavy boot was the only warning. Silas heard it. In an instant, the weary drifter vanished, and the soldier took his place. His reaction was immediate, ingrained, and utterly without panic. "Down!" he yelled, shoving Ilara hard toward the reinforced root-cellar door set in the floor. "Get in! Bar it from the inside! Do not open it! Do not make a sound!" There was no time to argue. She scrambled into the dark, earthen-smelling hole, her heart hammering in her chest. She heard him grab his pistol and Liam's rifle. The heavy thud of the cellar door falling into place plunged her into darkness. She fumbled for the thick wooden bar and slid it into its iron brackets just as the first gunshot shattered the evening's peace. The battle was a chaos of noise and brutal violence. Silas, using the cabin's small window as cover, fired with deadly precision. One of the attackers, silhouetted against the twilight, cried out and fell from his horse. Silas worked the lever on the rifle, chambered another round, and fired again, wounding a second man who was charging the door. But he was badly outnumbered. Bullets hammered into the log walls of the cabin, splintering the wood, filling the air with the smell of gunpowder. One of the outlaws circled around and threw a torch onto the roof of the small, lean-to barn. The dry wood and hay caught instantly, and the structure went up in a terrifying whoosh of orange flame, lighting the entire homestead in a hellish glow. Ilara heard the terrified bellow of their single milk cow, a sound that was cut short with a sickening finality. Silas fought with a cold, desperate fury. This was not just a fight for his life, it was a battle against the ghosts of his past. He was driven by a single, burning need to protect, to not fail again. He was a formidable opponent, but the odds were impossible. Caleb Granger, smarter and more patient than his men, had used the fire and chaos to flank the cabin. As Silas leaned out to take aim, Granger brought the butt of his rifle down in a vicious arc. catching Silas on the side of the head. Stars exploded behind Silas's eyes. He staggered back, stunned, and in that moment of vulnerability, a bullet from Granger's pistol tore through his side. The force of it threw him to the floor. He tried to raise his rifle, but his strength was gone, and the world dissolved into a roaring darkness. The gang swarmed the property. They kicked in the cabin door, their boots crunching on the broken glass. They found Silas lying in a pool of his own blood and assumed he was dead or dying. They tried the root cellar door, but it was barred fast. Annoyed and in a hurry to be gone, Granger decided against wasting time to break it down. They ransacked the cabin, taking what little they could find: the remaining flour, the box of new cartridges, Liam's good axe. Satisfied with their loot and with having reasserted their brutal dominance, Granger ordered his men to leave. They rode off into the darkness, leaving behind a burning barn, a dying man, and a world that had been shattered for the second time. Inside the cellar, Ilara waited, crouched in the suffocating darkness, listening to the pounding of her own blood in her ears. She waited until the sounds of the men and their horses had faded, until the only sound left was the hungry crackle of the fire consuming her barn. After an eternity of terrified silence, she pushed up on the heavy door and slid the bar free. She emerged into a nightmare. The devastation was absolute. The air was thick with smoke. The fire cast dancing, monstrous shadows across the snow. And then she saw him. He was lying motionless, half in and half out of the cabin doorway, a dark, spreading pool of blood melting the snow beneath him. A scream tore from her throat, a sound of pure animal anguish. It was swallowed immediately by the vast, indifferent silence of the Wyoming night. The world had shrunk to the smell of smoke and blood. The night air, sharp and cold, was thick with it. The smoldering ruins of the barn pulsed with a malevolent, orange light, casting long, dancing shadows that turned the familiar landscape into a hellish tableau. Ilara knelt in the snow beside Silas, her mind a numb, roaring void. Her hands, trembling so violently she could barely control them, moved over his still form, searching, pleading. She felt for his breath, for the flutter of a heartbeat, for any sign that the spark of his life had not been extinguished. For a terrible, eternal moment. There was nothing. Then, beneath her frozen fingertips, at the side of his neck, she felt it. A pulse. Faint, shallow, as fragile as a bird's wing. But it was there. Hope, fierce and desperate and agonizing, ignited in her chest. It was a painful, searing thing, because it meant the fight was not over. It had just begun. Getting him inside was a battle against his dead weight and her own exhaustion. He was not a large man, but he was dense with muscle, and now he was as limp and uncooperative as a sack of grain. She was a small woman, worn thin by grief and hardship. She hooked her arms under his shoulders and pulled. He moved an inch, his boots dragging through the blood-stained snow. Her muscles screamed in protest. Her lungs burned in the freezing air, and a sob of frustration and despair tore from her throat. She would not be beaten. She would not let this happen again. She repositioned herself, taking a firmer grip on the collar of his coat. She dug her heels into the snow and leaned back, putting her entire weight into the effort. Inch by torturous inch, she dragged him across the frozen ground, away from the dying fire and into the relative safety of the cabin. She did not stop, did not rest, until his body was fully inside, leaving a dark, terrible trail behind them, a path that marked their desperate, shared will to survive. She slammed the broken door shut and dropped the bar, her body shuddering with the aftershocks of the effort. In the dim light of the single lantern she managed to relight. The true horror of his injuries became brutally clear. A dark, matted wound on the side of his head was oozing blood, and the gunshot wound in his side was a ragged, terrifying hole, bleeding profusely and staining the floorboards beneath him. Panic, cold and sharp, tried to claw its way up her throat. She had no medical training. Her knowledge was limited to the rudimentary herbal remedies her mother had taught her for fevers and coughs, and the practical, hard-won knowledge of a homeosteoper who knew how to bind a wound or set a simple break. This was beyond her. This was the work of a surgeon, a doctor. And the nearest doctor was a 2-day ride away, in a town that had already cast them out. She was alone. He was going to die. No. The word was a silent scream in her mind. She had lost a husband. She had lost a son. She would not lose this man. A cold, grim resolve settled over her, pushing the panic down. She moved with a desperate, focused efficiency. She tore long strips from her own petticoats, the nicest thing she owned. She filled her largest pot with snow and set it on the fire to boil. While the water heated, she took her sharpest knife and held it in the flames until the tip glowed red. With tears streaming down her face, she pressed the searing metal to the worst of the bleeding on his side. He spasmed, a low groan forcing its way through his clenched teeth, and the sickening smell of burned flesh filled the cabin. But the bleeding slowed to a sluggish ooze. It was a brutal, agonizing act, but it was necessary. She used the boiled water and a clean rag to wash the wounds as best she could, fighting back waves of nausea at the sight of so much blood and torn flesh with trembling fingers. She gently probed the wound in his side for the bullet. She could not feel it. It was lodged too deep. To cut further, to search for it blindly, would surely do more harm than good. She made the difficult, terrifying decision to leave it, to pray that his body could endure the piece of lead buried inside him. She packed the wound with a thick poultice of yarrow to staunch the bleeding and crushed willow bark to fight the fever she knew was coming. She bandaged him tightly with the strips of her petticoat, her hands now steady, her mind clear and focused on the single task before her, keeping him alive. The days and nights that followed blurred into a relentless, waking nightmare. A raging fever seized him, as she had known it would. He was lost to her, his body burning with a fire that had nothing to do with the hearth, his mind trapped in a delirium from which there seemed to be no escape. He thrashed on the pallet of furs, his limbs flailing against unseen enemies. And he talked. In a voice made raw and strange by the fever, he poured out the poison of his past. He cried out names, over and over. "Sarah, forgive me, Sarah, and Lily, Lily, run!" The names were spoken with such raw, desperate love and anguish that Alara knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that they were the wife and daughter he had spoken of. He was reliving the tragedy that had broken him, the failure that had sent him wandering into the wilderness of his own grief. "Raiders," he moaned, his hands clenching into fists. "Should have been there. I was gone, just for a day. Came back, just smoke and nothing." He relived the war, too. His mind was a battlefield of fragmented, horrific memories. He shouted orders to men who were long dead, his voice sharp with the authority of a soldier. He spoke of the thunder of cannons at Shiloh, the screams of wounded men in the wilderness of Virginia, the ever-present, cloying smell of death. "Hold the line," he would yell into the quiet of the cabin, his eyes wide and unseeing. "Do not let them break!" Alara sat by his side through it all, a constant, vigilant presence in his nightmare. She did not sleep for more than a few minutes at a time. She spooned water and thin, precious broth made from boiled rabbit bones between his cracked, dry lips. She bathed his feverish skin with cool cloths, trying to soothe the fire that was consuming him from within. And she listened. She listened to his tormented confessions, to the litany of his failures and his sorrows. And as she listened, the tender, fragile love she felt for him deepened into something fierce, something unbreakable, something fiercely protective. She was no longer just his lover. She was the guardian of his broken soul. She found herself whispering back to him, her voice a low, steady murmur in the fever-charged air. When he cried out for Sarah and Lily, she would smooth the hair back from his burning forehead. "They know you love them, Silas," she would whisper. "They are at peace. You are safe now. You are not alone." She was comforting the ghosts that haunted him, tending to the wounds of his spirit even as she fought to heal the wounds of his body. Their survival was a brutal, day-to-day struggle, The Grangers had taken most of what was left of their winter stores. The loss of their cow was a devastating blow, a sentence of slow starvation. Food, once merely scarce, was now a desperate, daily obsession. Ilara was forced to leave him for hours at a time, to venture out into the harsh, unforgiving landscape with Liam's rifle, the rifle Silas had taught her to use. She checked her snare lines with a desperate, prayerful hope. She learned to hunt with a patience born of necessity, standing motionless in the snow for what felt like hours, waiting for the flicker of a grouse or the twitch of a rabbit's ears. Every small victory, every skinny animal she brought back to the cabin, was a triumph against the encroaching threat of starvation. She grew gaunt, her cheekbones sharp in her thin face, her body aching with a fatigue so deep it felt as if it had settled in her bones. But her eyes, which had for so long been clouded with sorrow, now burned with a new, hard resolve. She was fighting for 2 lives now, and this singular, desperate purpose gave her a strength she did not know she possessed. The wilderness was a constant antagonist, a deep, bitter cold settled in, and keeping the cabin warm was a relentless battle. The woodpile Silas had so carefully built up dwindled with alarming speed. She spent hours each day with the axe, her swings clumsy and inefficient compared to his, her body protesting every blow. The vast, silent landscape was no longer just a backdrop to her grief. It was an active force, a cold, indifferent enemy she had to combat every single day. The silence, too, was different. It was no longer a peaceful, companionable thing. It was a constant, terrifying reminder of their utter isolation, of the thin, fragile line that separated life from death. After more than a week that had felt like a lifetime, a glimmer of hope appeared. One morning, she laid her hand on Silas's forehead and found that the raging heat had subsided. The fever had broken. He lay still, his breathing deep and even for the first time in days. A few hours later, he opened his eyes. They were clouded with confusion at first, but then they focused on her face, hovering over him. He was weak, disoriented, but he was lucid. The first conversation they had was made of just a few whispered words, but it was a monumental emotional turning point, a silent acknowledgement of the crucible they had passed through together. His eyes, clear but shadowed with a deep pain, searched her face. "You're alive," she whispered, a single tear tracing a path down her grimy cheek. He tried to lift a hand, but it was too heavy. His voice was a dry, cracking rustle. "They came." "Yes. I tried," he began, his voice breaking with the effort. "I am sorry for bringing this, for failing." Ilara silenced him, not with a word, but with a fierce, protective tenderness that shone in her eyes. She leaned closer, her expression more resolute than he had ever seen it. "You did not fail," she said, her voice low and intense. "You fought for me. You saved my life. You stayed. No one else stayed." In that moment, in the quiet of the cabin, surrounded by the evidence of their brutal struggle, they both understood. The bond between them was no longer a fragile thing born of shared loneliness. It had been tested by fire and blood, tempered into something unbreakable. The final weeks of winter were dedicated to Silas's slow, arduous recovery. It was not a quick or easy process. His body had been ravaged by the fever and the injury, and he was as weak as a newborn. He was in constant, nagging pain from the bullet still lodged in his side, and his frustration at his own physical limitations was a bitter, daily struggle. Ilara continued to care for him, her patience seemingly endless, but now he was an active, stubborn participant in his own healing. The first time he forced himself to sit up, the room spun and a cold sweat broke out on his brow. But he did it. A few days later, leaning heavily on her, he stood, his legs shaking beneath him. Then came the first few painful, shuffling steps from the pallet to the hearth. Each small victory was a monumental achievement, a step away from the grave. As his physical strength slowly returned, a different kind of change was happening within him. A cold, hard purpose was taking root in his soul, The haunted, weary look of the wandering drifter was gone, replaced by a grim, focused determination. He would sit for hours, staring into the fire, his expression hard as granite. He listened as Alara recounted the details of the attack, her voice cold and flat with a rage that had moved beyond tears. He would touch the new, puckered scar on his head, or the tender, angry flesh around the bullet that was now a permanent part of him. The trauma had not broken him. It had forged him into a weapon. The part of him that was a soldier, a part he had tried to bury under years of aimless wandering, now came to the forefront. He was no longer a man running from his past. He was a man with a singular, unalterable mission. The part concluded one afternoon, weeks after the attack. Silas stood on his own in the cabin doorway, his first time without support. He was still gaunt, his face pale and etched with pain, but he stood tall, his shoulders straight. He looked out at the vast, snow-covered landscape, at the blackened timbers of the barn, and his eyes were not the eyes of a victim. They were the eyes of a hunter. He turned and looked at Alara, who was watching him from across the room. There was no need for words. She saw the promise of vengeance in his gaze, a promise as cold and certain as the coming spring thaw. He was not just seeking justice for their stolen supplies or for the wounds he had sustained. He was seeking retribution for Liam and for Thomas, and he was seeking redemption for Sarah and for Lily, for the family he had failed to save so many years ago. Their desperate, shared survival had now transformed into a shared, silent quest for justice. The battle for their lives was over. The war was about to begin. An early, deceptive spring arrived in the Wyoming Territory, not with the gentleness of new life, but with the violence of a thaw. The deep snows of winter rotted from beneath, collapsing into a sodden, muddy mess that made the land a difficult, treacherous terrain. The air, still holding a wintry bite, smelled of wet earth and decay. This raw, unsettled season was a mirror to the change that had taken place within the walls of the small log cabin. The desperate period of survival and healing was over, replaced by the cold, methodical preparation for revenge. The cabin was no longer a home, a sanctuary of shared grief. It had become a base of operations. Silas, though not fully healed, pushed his body to its limits with a relentless, punishing discipline. The bullet remained lodged deep in his side, a constant, dull ache that served not as a weakness, but as a compass, a persistent reminder of his purpose. Each morning, before the sun had fully risen, he was outside, his breath pluming in the cold air. He practiced with his pistol and with Liam's rifle, his movements stiff and painful at first, but becoming steadier, more fluid, more precise with each passing day. The wandering, haunted look in his eyes was gone, burned away by a cold fire. The drifter had been buried, and the soldier and tracker he had once been was resurrected in his place. He studied the land with new eyes, noting the game trails not for sustenance but for lines of approach, mapping water sources, and identifying strategic, defensible vantage points. He was reawakening dormant skills, sharpening the deadly tools of his past. Alara's transformation was just as profound. The passive, grief-stricken victim was gone, and in her place stood a woman with a core of tempered steel. The act of saving Silas, of fighting for his life day after agonizing day, had ignited a strength within her that she did not know she possessed. When Silas finally announced that he was well enough to travel, to begin the hunt, she saw the unspoken intention in his eyes. He meant to go alone. She refused to be left behind. "This is not your fight alone, Silas," she said, her voice quiet but unyielding. They were standing by the hearth, the firelight casting hard shadows on their resolute faces. "It is too dangerous, Alara," he countered, his tone gentle but firm. "They are animals." "They are the animals who murdered my husband and my son," she retorted, her voice cracking with a sudden sharp fury. "Do not speak to me of danger. I have lived in the heart of it since the day they died. This is my fight. Vengeance for Liam and Thomas is my right, my duty. You will not take that from me." Silas looked at her, truly looked at her. He saw the unyielding fire in her eyes, the hard set of her jaw. He saw that her grief had not been erased, but had been forged into a weapon, as sharp and as deadly as any knife. He had wanted to protect her, to shield her from the violence to come, but he recognized in that moment that her participation was not a choice. It was a necessity. For her to truly heal, she had to face the demons that had shattered her world. He gave a slow, solemn nod. He relented, and their partnership entered a new, grim phase. He continued her training with the rifle, but the lessons were different now. They were no longer about hitting a rabbit for the stew pot. They were about killing men. The lessons were stark and practical. He taught her how to reload with speed and efficiency, her fingers fumbling at first, then becoming swift and sure. He taught her how to use the sparse cover the plains offered, how to make herself a smaller target, how to move from one position to another without exposing herself. "Control your breathing," he would say, his voice a low command. "Breathe out slow as you squeeze. Do not jerk the trigger. Surprise yourself." He taught her how to track, how to read the subtle language of the land, a broken twig, a scuff mark on a rock, the depth and spacing of a horse's print in the mud. He showed her how each sign told a story. She proved to be an apt and focused student. Her all-consuming desire for justice honed her senses, sharpened her focus, and gave her a grim, unwavering patience. They began their hunt not by riding into the wilderness, but by riding back into the heart of the society that had cast them out. They knew they could not take on the Granger gang alone, blind. They needed information, a direction. Their first stop was the settlement of Redemption. Their return caused a stir. They were no longer the pitiful widow and the suspicious drifter. As they rode down the muddy main street, people stopped and stared. They were a formidable-looking pair, hardened by their ordeal, their faces set with a grim, shared purpose. Ilara, sitting tall in her saddle, met the hostile stares of the townswomen with a cold indifference. Silas, his eyes constantly scanning, his hand resting near the butt of his pistol, radiated a quiet, dangerous competence that made the men who had once sneered at him look away. They went directly to the saloon, the grimy hub of all local gossip and information. The place fell quiet as they entered, the afternoon drinkers turning to stare. Silas walked to the bar, his boots making a heavy, deliberate sound on the floorboards. He ordered a whiskey he did not intend to drink and began to ask questions, his voice low and direct, making inquiries about Caleb Granger and his men. He was met with shrugged shoulders, hostile glares, and a wall of suspicion. The men loyal to Jebediah Smith gathered at the far end of the bar, their whispers loud enough to be heard. It was Jebediah himself who brought the confrontation to a head. Emboldened by his cronies and the whiskey in his gut, he strode toward Silas. "Looking for your friends, drifter?" he sneered. "Birds of a feather, I reckon. Outlaws and their women." He spat on the floor near Ilara's feet, his eyes filled with a vile, insinuating contempt. Before Silas could react, Ilara stepped forward, moving to stand beside him. Her voice, when she spoke, was not loud, but it was as clear and cold as ice, and it cut through the saloon's grimy atmosphere like a razor. "The men we are looking for are named Granger," she said, her eyes locked on Jebediah. "5 of them rode to my homestead last fall. They burned my barn to the ground. They killed my milk cow. They stole what little food we had to survive the winter. And they put a bullet in this man when he tried to stop them, leaving him to die in the snow." She paused, letting her words sink in, her gaze sweeping over the silent, staring faces of the other men in the saloon. Then, she turned her full, unbridled fury upon them all. Her words were like whips, lashing them with the truth. "You whisper behind your hands and you pass judgment on me," she said, her voice ringing with a righteous, moral authority. "You judged me for taking in a dying man, for trying to survive in a world that left me with nothing. You stand here in your warm, safe houses and you talk of propriety, but what have any of you done about the real evil that rides through this land? What have you done about the men who murder your neighbors, who burn their homes, who leave children without fathers and wives without husbands?" Her voice rose, filled with a grief and rage that had been silenced for too long. "You do nothing. You cower and you pray and you pretend it is not your concern. You judged me for trying to live, but you do nothing while murderers roam free. Your piety is nothing but a shield for your fear." Her speech stunned the saloon into a shocked, shamed silence. The men could no longer see her as a fallen woman, an object of their scorn. They were forced to see her as she was, a victim of the very violence they had chosen to ignore, a woman of terrifying, unbreakable strength who was now demanding a reckoning. Jebediah, his face flushed with anger and humiliation, had no answer. He backed away, muttering under his breath. But Alara's words had had an unexpected effect. A seed of shame had been planted. As Silas and Alara turned to leave, a large, quiet man with the soot-stained hands of a blacksmith stepped in front of them. "Granger," the blacksmith said, his voice a low rumble. "I lost a freight wagon to them last year. They use an old, abandoned mining camp up in the Black Creek foothills. They think no one knows of it." As they stepped outside into the muddy street, another unexpected ally emerged from the shadows of the sheriff's office. It was Sheriff Prendergast, a man whose uniform was as faded as his authority, his face a roadmap of whiskey and regret. He was a man who had long been complicit in the lawlessness of the territory through his own inaction. But Alara's speech, and the cold determination he saw in Silas, had stirred a dormant ember of his long-lost sense of duty. "Hold up," he said, his voice raspy. He looked from Silas to Alara, a flicker of grudging respect in his bloodshot eyes. "What that blacksmith told you is true. The canyon is narrow. It is a bad place to get into, and a worse place to get out of." He reached into his coat and pulled out a heavy box of cartridges. "You will need these more than I do." He pressed the box into Silas's hands. He was too broken a man to join their fight, but his small act of assistance was a moral victory, a tiny piece of his own redemption. With a destination now in mind, Silas and Alara left the settlement behind them. Their relationship was now a true partnership, one of equals, forged in tragedy and hammered into shape by a shared, unbreakable purpose. They traveled north, into the rugged, rocky foothills, the landscape becoming more treacherous with every mile. The narrative of their lives was now written in the details of their journey, the cold, sleepless nights spent sharing watches, the silent, unspoken communication as they moved through the wilderness, the shared cup of coffee by a small, smokeless fire. They began to find signs, the tracks of 5 shod horses driven hard, the remains of a recent campfire, the ashes still faintly warm, a discarded whiskey bottle, the same brand they sold at the saloon in Redemption. The tension built with each piece of evidence that brought them closer. They were no longer hunting a memory, a faceless evil. They were hunting real men. The psychological toll of the hunt was immense. Alara was a taut wire of fear and a burning, righteous hatred. In her saddlebag, wrapped in a piece of clean cloth, she carried the small, worn wooden horse that had belonged to her son. At night, she would hold it in her hand, its smooth, familiar shape a talisman, a connection to the love that fueled her rage. Silas was grimly, silently focused, the ghosts of Sarah and Lily, of Liam and Thomas, driving him forward. This was his chance to finally succeed in his role as a protector, to bring justice where he had once known only failure. Late one afternoon, after 2 days of hard riding, they reached a high ridge overlooking a narrow, winding canyon. Silas dismounted and crept to the edge, motioning for Alara to do the same. They lay prone on the cold rock, looking down into the shadows below. Nestled amongst a jumble of boulders and the skeletal remains of old mining equipment was the camp. A single campfire flickered, its smoke a thin, gray smudge against the darkening rock. They could see the dark shapes of men moving about, their voices carrying faintly on the wind. They counted 4 of them. They had found them. The hunt was over. The battle was about to begin. Silas and Alara lay side by side on the ridge, the rifles resting on the rock before them, looking down at their sworn enemies. The air was still and cold and heavy with impending violence. The sun was dying on the horizon, its last light bleeding across the bruised purple sky in violent shades of orange and red. On the cold, windy ridge overlooking the canyon, Silas and Alara lay motionless, the biting wind tugging at their clothes. For hours, they had watched the camp below, their eyes missing nothing. They studied the layout of the dilapidated shacks, the number of men, their careless, drunken routines. There were 4 of them, as the blacksmith had said. They were loud, their laughter coarse and ugly as it drifted up on the wind. They passed a bottle between them, their movements sloppy and arrogant. They were comfortable in their squalor, underestimating the world, completely unaware of the judgment that lay waiting for them on the ridge. Silas formulated the plan, his voice a low whisper against the moan of the wind. It was simple and brutal, relying on the element of surprise and the natural choke point of the narrow canyon. They would wait for the dead of night, for the hours after midnight when the cold and the whiskey had seeped deep into the outlaw's bones, dulling their senses. He would descend first and deal with the sentry. Then they would position themselves at opposite ends of the small camp, creating a crossfire. He went over it with Alara twice, his words precise, the instructions of a soldier. It was a grim, final communion before the battle. When he was done, he turned to her, his face a hard mask in the fading light. "This is your last chance to stay back," he said, his voice quiet but intense. "Let me do this alone, Alara. You have been through enough." She met his gaze without flinching, her own just as hard, just as resolute. She had not come this far to falter now. "For Thomas and Liam," she said, her voice unwavering. It was not a plea, it was a vow. The hours of waiting were a unique form of torture. The world grew dark, the sliver of a moon casting a pale, ghostly light on the rocks. They did not speak of love, or of a future that might exist beyond this night. There was no future beyond this night. There was only the mission. Instead, in the profound, heavy silence, Silas took her rifle and checked it one last time, the metallic click of the action a final, sharp punctuation in the quiet. She, in turn, reached out and gently readjusted the rough bandage on his coat where his old wound still ached, a gesture of profound, unspoken intimacy. It was a quiet acknowledgement of their shared fate, of the blood and pain that bound them together. He looked away, out into the vast, dark emptiness of the plains. "When I was a boy," he said, his voice a low murmur, "my father took me fishing on the Missouri. We did not say much, just sat on the bank, the sun on our backs. I remember the smell of the river mud, the sound of the cicadas in the trees. I caught a catfish, so big I could hardly hold it." He fell silent for a moment, lost in the memory. It was a good day, just a quiet, good day. It was a small, simple gift, a memory of a time before the war, before the killing, before the world had broken him. It was his way of giving her a piece of the boy he had once been. It was his way of saying goodbye. Under the faint moonlight, they began their descent. They moved like ghosts down the steep, rocky slope, their steps silent and sure. The tension was a living thing, a cold knot in Alara's stomach. She was acutely aware of everything, the desperate, frantic pounding of her own heart, the solid, cold feel of the rifle stock in her hands, the sharp intake of her breath every time a loose pebble skittered away into the darkness. At the bottom of the canyon, a lone sentry stood near the horses, his back to them, his collar pulled up against the cold. Silas motioned for Alara to wait. He moved forward, a shadow detaching itself from other shadows. The sentry never heard him. There was a single, swift, brutal movement, a glint of steel in the moonlight. The man made a soft, sighing sound and collapsed without a struggle. Silas had taken him out with a thrown knife, a chillingly precise and silent kill that spoke of a deadly efficiency learned on forgotten battlefields. The final, tragic climax of their story had begun. They moved to their planned positions, Alara taking cover behind a rocky outcrop to the south, Silas melting into the shadows of a collapsed mine shaft to the north. He raised his rifle, took aim at the figure closest to the fire, and squeezed the trigger. The gunshot shattered the night stillness, a deafening crack that echoed off the canyon walls. The man by the fire spun around and fell, a dark stain spreading across his chest. The other outlaws, startled from their drunken stupor, scrambled for their weapons, shouting in confusion and alarm. Ilara's heart leaped into her throat. Her fear was a wild, frantic thing, but the hate that had simmered inside her for so long was a fire that burned hotter. She picked her target, a man staggering out of one of the shacks, just as Silas had instructed. She aimed, held her breath, and fired. The shot went wide, the bullet ricocheting off the rock wall behind him with a high-pitched whine. But it served its purpose. It divided their attention, throwing them into deeper confusion. The gunfight descended into a chaotic, ugly brawl. This was not a stylized Western shootout. It was desperate, loud, and brutally real. Silas, using his tactical knowledge, moved with a fluid grace between points of cover, his shots methodical and deadly. He killed the second outlaw as the man stumbled into the open, his pistol firing wildly into the night. Ilara, her initial panic replaced by a cold surge of adrenaline, found her nerve. She worked the lever on her rifle, chambered a new round, took aim at the third man, and fired again. This time, her aim was true. The bullet hit the man in the leg, and he went down with a scream, clutching his shattered limb, taken out of the fight. Only Caleb Granger was left. He was more cunning than his men. He used the chaos to dive behind a stack of old, rotting mining timbers, firing back wildly into the darkness. He and Silas were now locked in a deadly duel, their gunshots echoing through the narrow canyon. Ilara, from her position, provided covering fire, her shots splintering the wood near Granger's head, forcing him to stay down, allowing Silas to move to a better position. The confrontation became intensely personal. Granger, his face contorted with rage, recognized Silas from the homestead attack. "I remember you!" he screamed into the darkness, his voice raw with hate. "Come to die for that whore? I should have finished her when I had the chance, after we were done with her, of course." His cruel, taunting words fueled Ilara's rage, but they had the opposite effect on Silas. They did not make him reckless. They made him colder, his focus narrowing to a single, sharp point. This was not about anger anymore. This was an execution. Silas, moving with a speed that belied his old injury, got a clean angle and fired. His bullet tore through Granger's shoulder. The outlaw leader roared in pain and fury. It was a fatal mistake. Enraged and wounded, he rose from his cover and made a desperate, blind charge, firing his pistol wildly in Silas's direction. In that single, terrible moment, the world seemed to slow down. Ilara had a clear shot. She brought her rifle to her shoulder, lined up the sights on the center of Granger's charging form, and squeezed the trigger. Her bullet struck him squarely in the chest. At the exact same instant, Granger's last wild, desperate shot found its mark, striking Silas high in his own chest, the impact throwing him backward against the rocks. A terrible, profound silence fell over the canyon, broken only by the soft crackling of the campfire and the low, agonized moans of the man Ilara had wounded. Caleb Granger lay dead in the dirt, and Silas, after a long moment, stumbled forward a single step before collapsing to his knees, his rifle clattering on the stony ground. "Silas!" Ilara screamed his name, the sound tearing from her soul. She ran to him, scrambling over the rocks, her own rifle forgotten. She fell to her knees beside him and cradled his head in her lap. She saw the dark, fatal wound, the blood already soaking through the front of his shirt. She knew, with a certainty that was as cold and absolute as death itself, that it was over. There was no desperate act of healing, no poultice, no prayer that could save him this time. He looked up at her, his face pale and serene in the moonlight. The pain was gone from his eyes. A strange, quiet peace had settled over him. He reached up a trembling hand and touched her face, his fingers smearing blood on her cheek. "Did you see?" he whispered, his voice barely audible, a soft rustle of dry leaves. "I did not fail this time. I protected my family. In his dying eyes, he saw not just Alara, but the embodiment of the wife and daughter he had lost, the family for whom he had finally, in death, found his redemption. He spoke of them then, of Sarah and Lily, not with the guilt that had haunted him for years, but with a gentle, simple love, as if he were about to see them again. He turned his gaze back to Alara, his eyes full of a lifetime of sorrow and a few short months of peace. "You brought me back to life, Alara," he said, his breathing becoming shallow, each word an effort. "You made me a good man, even if just for a little while." Alara was sobbing, pressing her face against his, her tears mingling with his blood. "Do not leave me," she begged, her voice choked with a grief so profound it felt as if it would tear her apart. "Please, Silas, do not leave me alone." He smiled faintly, a sad, gentle curve of his lips. "It is all right," he whispered. "It is a good place to rest." His eyes fluttered, then closed, and he was gone. The aftermath was stark and quiet. Alara sat there in the dirt and the blood, holding his body until the first pale, gray light of dawn touched the canyon rim. The cold seeped into her bones, but she did not feel it. At sunrise, she rose, her movements stiff and mechanical. She performed her final, heartbreaking duties. She found Granger's own shovel, and with a strength born of grief, she dug a grave for Silas on the ridge where they had waited, a place that overlooked the entire canyon. She wrapped him in his bedroll and buried him, placing a simple cross of stones to mark the spot. Then she went back down into the canyon. The last outlaw, the one she had shot in the leg, was still alive. She dispatched him without hesitation, without a word, her actions cold and final. Justice, at last, had been served. The story concludes with Alara, a solitary figure standing against the vast, empty canvas of the western sky. She was no longer the broken woman from the beginning of the story, a fragile vessel of grief. She was a woman forged by love and loss into something unbreakable. She had known a profound love that defied prejudice and brought a terrible, bloody justice, but it had cost her everything she had. She gathered Silas's gun and the few possessions she had left. She did not return to the cabin. It was a place of too many ghosts. She turned her back on the settlement of redemption. It was a place of too much judgment. She walked away, her face toward the setting sun, her future a blank, unknown territory. She was alone once more, but she was not defeated. She carried the memory of Silas not as a burden of grief, but as a source of enduring, resilient strength. His sacrifice had given her a future, however lonely it might be. She faced the immense, indifferent wilderness, a tragic and resilient figure, a testament to the brutal realities and the enduring, transformative power of love in the American West. Thank you for listening to our story. We would love to connect with you in the comments, so please let us know where you are listening from. Subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts in English.